Sorry about all the wires, I feel like a Cyberman. It's lovely to be back at Youth Conference again. This was always my favourite conference, and I think last time I came it was before COVID. I tend to judge everything in my life now by before lockdown and after lockdown. And this is such a significant topic. Coercion. The enormous trumpeting elephant in the room when it comes to the abortion debate. Before I go any further, I do want to reiterate what was said yesterday. I appreciate that this is an extremely sensitive subject, and if any of the material is upsetting to you, some of it is very harrowing, please don't be upset alone. Okay, there are people here who you can talk with. The important thing is that you're not upset, you don't leave this room feeling like you've got nowhere to go. What I find interesting about this subject, having spent many years at SPUC researching life issues, is that concerns about coercion are taken completely seriously and are central to the debate when it comes to other life issues, such as euthanasia, but then get absolutely ignored when it comes to issues that affect women specifically, such as abortion. Why is it that when it comes to euthanasia, we acknowledge, albeit grudgingly at times, that a person may feel coerced into choosing assisted suicide, but society generally assumes that a woman choosing abortion cannot possibly feel under any pressure whatsoever to walk into that facility? To acknowledge or even consider the possibility of coercion is to challenge the prevailing narrative that abortion is a form of empowerment. So it's with the euthanasia debate that I would like to begin. The fear of coercion, most specifically the fear of being a burden, is a real problem for people struggling with terminal illness, disability or mental health problems. And it was this concern that led a House of Lords committee to urge unanimously against any change in the law when it was investigated way back in the 1990s. The committee warned, "We concluded that it was virtually impossible to ensure that all acts of euthanasia were truly voluntary and that any liberalisation of the law in the United Kingdom could not be abused. We were also concerned that vulnerable people, the elderly, lonely, sick or distressed, would feel pressure, whether real or imagined, to request an early death." But it surely follows that if we fear that a vulnerable person may be coerced into choosing an early death for themselves, we should be concerned about the possibility a pregnant woman may find herself in just that position when it comes to abortion. I'm generally a bit allergic to constantly labelling women as vulnerable. It seems to feed into the kind of Victorian narrative of women as victims. But the fact is, women in the early stages of pregnancy can be intensely vulnerable. She may fear that her baby represents an impossible burden on her resources, or more commonly those of a boyfriend, husband, or her wider family. She may be unwell. You're most likely to be sick with a pregnancy in the first 12 weeks. She may be confused or in a state of denial. And just as it's impossible to see how there could ever be safeguards to prevent a sick person from being coerced into euthanasia, it is nigh on impossible to see how we can create the same safeguards when it comes to abortion. Some years ago, a gentleman who will remain nameless because I do not wish to be sued was accused by his former girlfriend of having forced her into aborting her baby. This was a very serious case, and one, as you can imagine, that I looked at very closely. The story made for distressing reading. Any case involving abortion inevitably does. The man in question strenuously denied the accusation and successfully sued the papers concerned for libel. He was eventually awarded substantial undisclosed damages and given several written grovelling apologies. But even before the courts ruled in that man's favour, my first thought when I heard about this case was that I hoped the papers had good lawyers and long pockets, because how on earth would they ever prove that that woman was coerced? Even if she was, which it was determined she was not, how in a court of law could it ever be proven that that woman was left in a situation where she had no choice but to have the abortion, unless someone had taped the man dragging her into the abortion facility and ramming her through the door, which I doubt anyone would have done. We certainly would have heard about it. Where was that evidence going to come from? Because coercion is an insidiously subtle form of control, which can be very difficult to quantify. So the first question we need to be asking is exactly what is coercion? Can it be defined? And I'm aware this is the graveyard slot. You've all had a very nice lunch. You've had a very intensive day. So I'm going to give you some work to do, please. I'm going to give you some scenarios, and I'd like a show of hands. First of all, have the abortion or I'll take things into my own hands. A physical threat. Is that coercion? Yeah, hands up if you think that's coercion. Okay, I think we're pretty much decided on that one. The threat to harm a woman if she has an abortion is very obviously coercion, and it's not always appreciated that in terms of criminal law, threatening to harm a person is an offence. Sadly, this is not as extreme or unusual a situation as it may first appear. Back in 2016, on the streets of London, a young woman called Mallory Bantala was severely beaten up by her ex-boyfriend and an accomplice with the deliberate intention of killing her unborn son, whom Mallory had sworn to protect. The case mirrors a very similar crime in New York, in which a woman called Mia Jones was so badly beaten up by her ex-boyfriend that her unborn baby died and she suffered life-threatening and life-changing injuries. Again, she had refused to abort their baby. Such incidents are extreme forms of intimate partner violence, but I have been shocked during my years of research by just how frequently women talk about being physically threatened when a pregnancy is inconvenient to a boyfriend, a husband, sometimes even other members of the family. A doctor told me some time ago, Dermot, where are you? There we are. This is Dermot Carney, about whom you will hear a little bit more later, that he'd come across cases, and this is something I've heard about from other doctors, who it wasn't the girl who was threatened, it was the boyfriend. You know, when the father of the boyfriend discovered that he'd got his girlfriend pregnant, he beat him up and kicked him out of the house. And that put the girl in this really awkward position of feeling that she had to abort away the problem for his sake. By the way, I gather they are now happily married. It's nice to have a happy ending just sometimes. According to the Women's Aid Federation, between 20 and 30% of women experience physical violence during pregnancy. So that's approaching a third. I'm not a mathematician, but that's a lot, 20 to 30%. With the violence being described as severe in 14% of cases. Violence can either begin or escalate during pregnancy. Added to this, unintended pregnancy is significantly higher in a relationship where there is violence, particularly sexual violence. So this is a very significant problem. Okay, second scenario. Have the abortion or I'll leave you. The withdrawal of emotional and practical support. Is that coercion? Hands up, please. Right, okay. Again, I think we're kind of in agreement. But what if it's a bit less specific? How about, if you don't have an abortion, it will ruin your life? Children are a nightmare. They are, by the way, but children are a nightmare. Generalised scare tactics. We've all had that comment, particularly when a very young woman gets pregnant. She's ruined her life. It's over. You know, that's the end of it. As one of the helpers at the Cardinal Winning Initiative has said, having a baby doesn't end your life, it changes it. The reality is so much more nuanced. And I think I'm allowed to say this because my eldest son is 16 and, you know, he brushes up fairly respectable now. But when I had my first baby, I walked around in a trance for 6 months. I mean, I was so sleep deprived. Everyone around me was going, "Oh, a baby! Oh, isn't it wonderful? Oh, a baby!" I was thinking, "Yes, it's wonderful. I'm so tired. Help! Somebody, I'm not fit for this. I can't do this. You know, I haven't had a wink of sleep in months." But you know, you sort of feel like you have to say you're really doing well when sometimes you're not. And People were very vocal, though, about how awful having a pregnancy, having a baby would be. No one told me what it would feel like to love and be loved like this. I was told my life would be turned upside down by the sleepless nights and the dirty nappies and the vomiting babies. And babies are sick all the time. And getting the mashed potato out of your hair when you're trying to do the weaning and things, and the overpriced childcare. No one said my life would be changed forever, having a small child curled up in my lap saying, "I love you, mummy." That's the bit they never talked about. Parenting is the biggest emotional roller coaster any person will ever have to ride. It's neither the panacea of all joy or a road to enslavement. It's just part of the natural order of things. It should be treated as such. Okay, another scenario. If you don't have an abortion, you'll ruin your health, you'll probably die. Is that coercion? Yeah. I'd say that's pretty much the worst form of coercion, the use of medical misinformation. We've had lifestyle scaremongering, here is medical scaremongering. Of course, a woman is going to feel under a pressure to have an abortion if she sincerely believes she's going to die without one. The name Savita will be familiar, I suspect, to all of you. Anyone from Ireland here? Yeah, we've all heard the name Savita. Okay, Savita was an Indian-born dentist living in Ireland who died as a result of a septic miscarriage. Having been over the results of that inquiry many times, it's very clear to me her death had nothing to do with the failure of doctors to give her an abortion. It was a result of a tragic chain of missed opportunities. The failure of departments to talk to one another in a timely manner. The failure to act upon serious indications that her condition was deteriorating. Savita's husband had every right to be angry about her death. No pregnant woman in a developed country should be left to die like that. But Ireland's pro-life laws were not the culprits there. Last year, an American woman called Andrea Prudent, was travelling in Malta with her boyfriend. She was heavily pregnant and her placenta ruptured. She was rushed to hospital, her condition was carefully monitored, but when she was refused an abortion, she went to the media claiming that her life was at risk. Headlines around the world spoke of fears for American women's safety in pro-life Malta, and "I just hope I get out of this country with my life." Now, I'm Maltese, okay, we're a bit touchy, okay? We're a little bit touchy about criticism. Okay, you would never guess. But her life was never in danger. Her insistence that she could not trust the obstetricians and gynecologists of Malta's Mater Dei hospital were frankly insulting. Pro-Life Malta has a considerably better record on maternal health than either the United Kingdom or the US. In a statement responding to the case, Doctors for Life affirmed, "We genuinely empathise with the apprehension of the couple in question and want to emphasise that the practice at Mater Dei Hospital always seeks to ensure that the mother's life is protected and given priority. Whenever such a case presents to hospital, a careful assessment is made to promptly assess the severity of the condition. The patient is intensively monitored and treated for any signs of infection. If serious hemorrhage or infection supervenes, the uterus is always evacuated. Such a decision is taken at the highest clinical level and would involve at least 2 consultants. Premature rupture of membranes does not always result in infection, and not all such pregnancies end up in a spontaneous miscarriage. This is why not all cases require evacuation of the uterus, induced labour, at the outset. This practice has stood the test of time, and our 0% maternal mortality for the last 12 years attests to that." Professor George Jeffrey Buttigieg reminded the media, who ignored him, that Malta has the finest maternal health record in the world. Our pro-life laws protect lives rather than ending them, and we should be proud to be world leaders when it comes to maternal health care. Now, I've been following the court case that is going on because she is now suing the government for damages. It has emerged that a midwife allegedly told Andrea Prudent that doctors would intervene when she was at the brink of death, which understandably terrified her. She should never have been told something like that because it wasn't true. No doctor worth his salt would gamble with a patient's life like that. It sounds to me like bad English. The midwife may have had a decent command of English, most Maltese people do. That doesn't mean she had a good understanding of idiom. It certainly raises the question as to whether interpreters should be used in very sensitive situations like this where words really matter, but that is another question. I don't imagine that the blundering misuse of language by a midwife was all that was going on here. I believe that this woman was deliberately lied to about the level of danger she was in. And on the basis of a lie, the Maltese Parliament is in very real danger of taking Malta from being the last country in Europe to protect the unborn to having some of the most ruthless abortion laws in the world. Final scenario, please. And this is played out in abortion facilities, sex education classes, and conversations about abortion hundreds of times a day, every day. Just have the abortion, it's no more traumatic than a heavy period. Deliberate misinformation about the nature of abortion is deliberately misrepresenting what happens in an abortion, a form of coercion. Yeah. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. I would argue there is a strong case for saying that withholding information from a woman in a way that is likely to influence her decision is a form of coercion. In any other field of medicine, if a doctor intentionally misled a patient about the seriousness of a procedure, he would risk being struck off. It's actually quite serious. A doctor is obliged to warn a patient about any risks which may be life-changing, fatal, or minor but common. This can sometimes border on the absurd. I have screamed in agony, barely hearing the anaesthetist saying, "I'm obliged to tell you there is a 3% chance that you may suffer headaches as a result of the spinal anaesthesia." And even when I've shouted, "Just hit me with a cricket bat! Just do something!" They have not done anything, particularly not that, until I was completely aware of the risks of the procedure, because it's all to do with giving consent. A core principle of consent is surely the right to give informed consent. If a person does not know to what she is consenting, how can she be giving free and full consent? And the truth about abortion is concealed on every level. The deception tends to begin with descriptions of the unborn child, and we're all very aware of this in the pro-life movement. Abortion practitioners and campaigners have developed very imaginative and unscientific expressions, such as the products of conception, the contents of the uterus, fetal tissue, pregnancy tissue. Do you know, if you lose a baby, they actually ask you if you want your pregnancy tissue buried? Like, you know, who gives a funeral to pregnancy tissue? It's absurd. Some cases, it goes as far as parasite, hijacker, and invader. It's very telling that when, back in 2015, the abortion industry's trade in baby body parts was exposed, Planned Parenthood's Cecile Richards continued to refer to our involvement with fetal tissue research, whilst Planned Parenthood members were caught on camera discussing baby eyeballs. The deliberate concealment of the truth about surgical abortion is unlike anything I have come across in any other area of medicine. The literature produced by abortion facilities inevitably refers to the gentle suction required to relieve a woman of the products of conception. It's instructive to compare the patronising, coaxing tone employed in these instances compared with patient information on hernia repair or caesarean or even tooth extraction. I tell you something, read a leaflet about tooth extraction, you'll never eat sugar again. It's really, really frightening, but it's frightening because it has to be. Like nervy children, women considering abortions are reassured that a gentle suction method is used to remove the pregnancy from the uterus. A suction machine will be used to gently complete the evacuation. The Dilapan works by gently opening the cervix, and the cervix must be prepared to cause it to gently dilate over a few hours. By the way, speaking as mother of 4 children, the cervix never gently dilates. You know when women scream in labour? They're not doing it to try to break the windows. It's because it really, really is difficult to get the cervix to dilate. Okay, it never dilates gently, just so you know. I've never seen this word, gently, used at all in medical literature, certainly not so relentlessly, except in the apparently factual, no-nonsense materials put out by abortion facilities. It's difficult to see how women can expect to feel empowered if they're made to feel like panicky infants in need of constant reassurance. It'll all be very gentle. I have had students angrily denounce me for making the point that doctors know perfectly well that they are ending a life. But this is the ugly and obvious reality. And if you don't want to take a pro-life doctor's word for it, and doctors who have rejected abortion are pretty open about the hundreds and sometimes thousands of deaths they've caused, how about taking seriously the words of a Planned Parenthood practitioner, secretly filmed, stating, "Ignoring the fetus is a luxury of activists and campaigners. I think we should be less about denying the reality of those images and more about acknowledging that, yeah, that's quite a truth. So let's just give them all the violence. It's a person, it's killing. Let's just give them all that." And then the more compelling question is, why is this the most important thing I could do with my life? But the compelling question I would like to ask there is, do you give that truth to your patients? Do you speak so bluntly and honestly about the violence of abortion to the women who come to your clinic? Because if you do not, you are colluding in a cruel act of deception that's unjustifiable in every way. I would like to know if any doctor has or would ever respect a woman enough to look her in the eye and say, "If I perform an abortion, I will take the life growing peacefully in your womb, and here is how I will do it. Here are the instruments. Let me talk you through the process." I would like the evidence of a single abortion practitioner who has done any woman the courtesy of being 100% truthful. Because if medical teams, counsellors, and the literature itself are not giving women an accurate description of what they are doing, they are not consenting. Women are not consenting, they're being coerced. A major argument behind the recent buffer zone legislation was that women need protecting from people who may pressure them into not having an abortion by their presence outside facilities. But such an argument cuts both ways. A pro-life campaigner might make the case that if abortion facilities told women the whole truth about abortion, they would have nothing to fear from members of the public who stand outside facilities and do just that. Those vigils, which many pro-life campaigners admit to finding a serious strain, may represent the one and only last chance for a woman to hear an alternative to abortion. Incidentally, some years ago, when buffer zones were first being debated, this debate is quite a long one, it's been going on for years, I was at an entirely pro-abortion discussion panel in Oxford where this topic came up, buffer zones, should people be allowed to stand outside clinics? And feminist writer Naomi Wolf made the point that if women are upset by the presence of people praying outside facilities, do you know something they need to be upset? We're grown-ups. She represented the only really refreshing radical feminist voice on that panel. Are pro-life vigils upsetting? They might be, but we're women, not children. We don't need people to cover our eyes and censor what we're permitted to see. But we've now reached a point where 2 Catholics can be arrested, interrogated, charged and dragged before the courts for praying. Isabel, are you still here? I mean, she's really scary. I mean, have you seen, you saw Isabel this morning? I mean, I can see why it took 3 police officers to arrest her. I mean, how scary was that? I would be really intimidated if I came across Isabel and Father Goff. I mean, have you seen him? He actually smiles and things. I mean, there's obviously something sinister going on. But praying inside your own head. I mean, how do we get to this level of lunacy? It goes without saying, if the unpalatable details of the abortion process are not volunteered to women, the possible psychological consequences are not going to be discussed either. Furthermore, there is a strong correlation between coercion and post-abortion trauma. I've read about and listened to probably hundreds of accounts now by women who have regretted their abortions. And contrary to popular belief, there are few common threads. It's very common to hear people on the other side saying, oh, they're probably all guilt-ridden Catholics or something. They've probably been told. The reason they're feeling guilty is because they were told it's wrong and it's all just coming home to roost. It's not our fault. Actually, that's not the case. The women whose accounts I have read came from different countries, cultures, religions, socioeconomic backgrounds, different ages, different generations sometimes. But the one common thread that runs through virtually every story is a sense of having been coerced. Either the woman will say, I had no choice. My family would not have supported me. My father would have beaten the living daylights out of me. I was told I'd bring shame on the family. I was told I was stupid, selfish, needed to do the decent thing. Or the woman will say, I had no idea it would be like that. They wouldn't let me look at the ultrasound. They said it was just cells. They said it was just a blob. They said it would be like a heavy period. They said, I just feel relieved. No one told me it would be so painful, so traumatic, so life-altering. No one bothered to tell me that I would still be grieving for my child 40 years later. And some women who do approach helplines come back after decades from having an abortion. It does not surprise me in the least that the abortion industry will not do women the courtesy of acknowledging the pain of post-abortion trauma. After the Irish referendum, PAT was dismissed as a makey-uppy thing that doesn't exist in the Irish Parliament. Because how can an industry be expected to admit to the existence of a problem it's created through its own inability to tell the truth about a so-called service it provides? It also came as a little surprise to me when Mary Stopes International showed its commitment to choice by going after two Catholic doctors who were providing abortion pill reversal treatment. Dr. Eileen Riley and Dr. Dermot Carney were reported to the General Medical Council and subjected to a lengthy and traumatic disciplinary process, during which they faced the prospect of being struck off and losing their careers, not to mention their reputations. They were eventually exonerated, but the aggression with which these doctors were treated, simply for trying to give women a choice, trying to offer that lifeline, raised many questions about the abortion industry's true agenda when it comes to the promotion of DIY abortion. For anyone who's new to the debate, it was discussed a little bit yesterday, but COVID was used as a bit of a smokescreen to promote selling pills by post. It was supposedly temporary. It is now a permanent provision. The Abortion Act of 1967 did not make provision for abortion to be carried out in any but a registered clinical setting. Chemical abortion, or RU486 as it's called sometimes, it involves a woman taking two pills 24 hours apart, and it's this delay of 24 hours that can be excruciating for the woman. And it's after taking that first pill that some women start to experience regret and to start to look for a way to remedy the situation. Abortion pill reversal offers the only possibility to a distraught woman desperately trying to save her baby. It involves prescribing progesterone until around 14 weeks, and it works in some cases. It's not 100% successful. I should think Dr. Carney will talk more about that tomorrow. But this is a lifeline that MSI was determined to cut by attacking the UK's two practitioners, both highly experienced doctors with unblemished reputations in their fields. Their opponents went so far as to claim that Dr. Carney's Catholicism rendered him incapable of practicing medicine objectively. Think about that for a moment. An abortion chain with close links to the NHS and the government basically suggested that Catholics can't be trusted as doctors. As far as I'm aware, the GMC have not responded to this complaint. Diversity and inclusivity means all of us, Mr. Sunak. But what Dr. Carney pointed out to me is that not just some, but all the women who contacted him for abortion pill reversal treatment felt coerced into having those abortions. All of them, and not just by parents. In some cases, the women were threatened by the social services. If you have that baby, it'll be taken away. You'll never see it again. Now, that's a terrible thing to say to a pregnant woman. It's very, very frightening, the prospect of being separated permanently from your child. Friends coercing women. Peer pressure does not end in the playground. You weren't thinking of having that baby, were you? Oh gosh, she's such a slut. Do you know what she's done? You know, she's going to ruin her life. In the age of social media, it can be even more of a problem. So if every single woman who turned to abortion pill reversal to try to save their babies admitted to feeling coerced into getting rid of it, what does that say about the so-called counselling women are supposed to get before the procedure? If women are changing their minds mid-process, what checks and balances are in place to protect women who are pushed into abortions they don't want? Bear in mind also, we only have figures for women who change their mind and act on that impulse. We don't know how many women take that second pill with a heavy heart because they believe they have no alternative. The work of Dr. Carney and Dr. Riley in the field of abortion pill reversal treatment has exposed the ugly truth behind pills by post. Far from giving women choice, it removes any protection for women who are under pressure to abort. It's become increasingly popular in certain feminist circles in the US. Anyone from the US here? Yeah. You know what I'm going to say. To dress up as handmaids as a nod to Margaret Atwood's Hamilton. You know, the white bonnet and the red dress and the boots, okay? And you see them turning up all over the place outside the houses of Supreme Court judges and things like that. The implication is that the overturning of Roe v. Wade reduces women to the status of the handmaids in Atwood's dystopian novel. Deprived of all rights over their own bodies, relegated to the role of breeders in a world where infertility has become a curse, threatening the world's future. The only problem I have with this symbolism is that it's nonsense. It is really stupid. You're not supposed to say stupid, it's not very intellectual, but it's a really stupid image because there is a huge moral difference between a society that protects human life at all stages and a society that's based on rape and sex slavery. Furthermore, it's hypocritical nonsense because what these groups deliberately ignore is the fact that we have created the world of The Handmaid's Tale. You may not be aware of it, but we have created the world of The Handmaid's Tale, and it's ignored and condoned by the very groups and individuals who claim to care about women's rights. I realise that this conference is primarily about abortion, but abortion does come into this field, and that is commercial surrogacy. Sometimes euphemistically referred to as fertility tourism, this is a system through which wealthy Western couples travel to developing countries to buy themselves a womb, to incubate an IVF embryo. The surrogates are housed in dormitory-style buildings, often separated from their families for the entirety of the pregnancy. They're usually kept under constant observation, forced to take a battery of drugs. In many cases, they will have signed contracts they cannot read, in a language they do not understand, and the medical terminology will not be explained to them. If the couple get cold feet and decide against having the baby after all, or if something turns out to be wrong, if the baby has a disability, the surrogate may be expected to undergo an abortion whether or not she believes in abortion, whether or not it goes against her own ethical principles. During my research for the Abolition of Woman, I came across studies warning that in some cases surrogates were given abortion pills without their knowledge and were then told that they'd had a miscarriage and, by the way, would only get half the fee. What is this other than the hell of the Handmaid's Tale, in which the poverty trap is used to force women to become breeders for infertile couples, whilst their enslavement is justified through a toxic neo-colonial narrative in which these women are expected to be pathetically grateful to be exploited in this way, in exchange for money that in no way compensates for the trauma they go through. But perhaps the most heinous attack on women's rights is sex-selective abortion, a practice that is common all over the world, including here in Britain. In their book Half the Sky, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn write, "More girls have been killed in the last 50 years precisely because they are girls than men were killed in all the wars of the 20th century combined." Sex-selective abortion is an attack on women at every possible level, eliminating a baby girl simply because she is a girl. And sex-selective abortion almost always targets girls. Subjecting a pregnant woman to the trauma of an oft unwanted abortion to satisfy a family's desire to avoid the inconvenience of a daughter. And we know that the consequences for women of the gender imbalance that's caused by sex-selective abortion are many and complex, including increased incidences of infanticide, rape, kidnap, baby smuggling, bride purchase, trafficking, levirate marriage, where a woman is forced to marry her dead husband's brother, and wife sharing. But what is much less closely scrutinised is the devastating impact of sex-selective abortion upon the mothers themselves. Women who are coerced into a late-term abortion, and sex-selective abortions by definition are carried out later in the pregnancy, they have to be able to tell the sex of the baby. It increases the trauma, therefore, to the pregnant woman. I came across a particularly haunting case in India where a woman was forced to undergo 2 late-term abortions because they were girls. She didn't want either of those abortions, it goes without saying. But she was repeatedly beaten, not just by her husband, but by her father-in-law, until she was simply too frightened to protect the baby any longer. In another occasion, I was personally involved in an asylum case involving a Chinese couple who had defied the country's family planning policies. The woman had very severe post-abortion trauma because she had been forced to undergo 2 abortions because she must have a boy. She had the worst case of post-abortion trauma I've ever come across. She actually compensated for the deaths of those baby girls by fantasizing that they never died. I've never seen this happen before. The abortions had happened 8 and 10 years before, and in her mind, she had an 8 and 10-year-old child, and she gave them names, and she gave them personalities. It was the only way she could live with what had happened. Unfortunately, because we do not accept the existence of post-abortion trauma in this country, the asylum case was thrown out, and they are now, I believe, back in Beijing. Some groups do speak about the dangers of sex-selective abortion, but tend to remain evasive when they talk about abortion itself, or they just defend abortion as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. You cannot possibly criticise abortion under any circumstances, including suggesting, as one Guardian journalist did suggest, that it's actually perfectly rational for a woman to do this, because, what if a livid patriarch, deprived of a male heir, turned his fury on both mother and daughter? She'd be perfectly justified in seeking a sex-selective abortion. Now, it really troubles me that self-proclaimed feminists apparently believe that sacrificing the lives of baby girls to appease violent misogyny is actually acceptable. But supporting abortion for women who are being threatened into it by violent men is to condone surgical rape, because forced abortion is surgical rape. It should not be seen in any other way. If feminists really want to stand up for the right to bodily integrity, this should be completely unacceptable. And we must not make the mistake of thinking that this only happens in other countries. It's very easy to convince ourselves that it's not really our problem. I've had people say that, it's none of my business, it's not my problem. Some years ago, undercover journalists filmed themselves asking for sex-selective abortions, which they were granted. One doctor actually said, "That's not fair. That's female infanticide." And then he signed the paper for the abortion. So female infanticide was a bit naughty, really, but he was going to allow it. The government then, to try to diffuse the tension about this, to diffuse criticism, led an investigation which was little more than a whitewash, in which it concluded that sex-selective abortion doesn't happen in Britain. There's no evidence at all that this is a problem. The Independent newspaper conducted its own investigation with the help of statisticians. And what they did was they looked at the sex ratio for first babies and then second and third. They looked at sex ratios depending upon the order in which a baby was born in a family. And normally, you'd expect a ratio of about 104 boys to 100 girls. That's a natural ratio, 104 boys to 100 girls. That's because it's nature's way of compensating, I think, for the fact that more boys than girls die in infancy. And also, boys have a lot more accidents than girls. I'm sorry, it's just a fact. They do just do more silly things than girls do. Sorry. But the point is, by the time they reach adulthood, the ratio should be about 1 to 1. So if those numbers are significantly skewed, then something's going on. There is abortion going on. In some parts of India, the sex ratio has been as serious as 140 boys to 100 girls, and that's an unsustainable gap. It's never good for a society to have a massive surplus of single men who can never marry and establish a family. So when the Independent newspaper looked at ratios for first births compared with subsequent births, what they found was, for the first birth and second birth, the ratio was about right. Because in fact, even if there is a son preference, most families will accept a girl the first time, because they could have a boy later, or a girl the second time. But by the time it gets to the third pregnancy, desperation starts to strike. And that's where you see a skewed sex ratio starting. And the sex ratio became progressively more and more skewed the further down the line the baby was born. The same results were found in Canada and also the US. Anne Furedi claimed that no one ever asks for sex-selective abortion unless they're a journalist. This is the same Anne Furedi who said that Isabel was doing a publicity stunt, deliberately got herself arrested because it's fun or something. As a matter of fact, she was wrong about that, she's wrong about this. Dr. Vincent Argent, the former medical director of her own organisation, BPAS, stated that sex-selective abortion is widespread, and it happens in all communities. When sex-selective abortion was being debated in Parliament, I heard passionate assurances that women are never coerced into having abortions they don't want. They are immediately identified as vulnerable, they are helped and supported to make the choice they wish to make, with absolutely no information being given as to how this happens in practice. And these assurances fly in the face of both recent studies on coercion and the lived reality for those who work with women to pick up the pieces. A case that's particularly instructive is that of a young woman named Samira, not her real name, who described the whole process of being forced into aborting a baby girl. She said, "On the day of the termination, I went into the clinic crying. I was crying and could not stop. The nurse saw I was upset, but she just said, 'Put these tablets inside you.' They weren't concerned that this person looked upset. I was crying, but I was trying to be careful because what if they didn't go ahead with the abortion and then my husband would blame me? I just wanted them to stop. I just wanted to run away from there, but where would I run away to? What would I do? The last day before I had the abortion, I said to my husband very clearly what he was doing was wrong. I felt I couldn't make the choice on my own, because what if I'd made that choice and gone ahead with the baby, and then he would probably end the pregnancy himself. He'd beat me up so badly that there would probably be no pregnancy inside me. I was scared of that. The worst thing was, when I went in, I had a bump, and when I came out, there was no bump. I kept touching it, and I just wanted to scream. But the noise wouldn't come out. I wanted my baby back." There are a number of things you need to consider from Samira's statement. Firstly, consider her dilemma. She's distraught, but part of her desperately wants to conceal how she's feeling because she's afraid of the consequences if she refuses an abortion. But the fact is, it's very clear this is a woman in severe distress who does not want to be there. I cannot think of another medical situation, apart possibly from a life-threatening emergency, where a doctor or nurse would continue treating a distraught patient without attempting to communicate with her about what the problem was, or to ask her if she felt able to proceed. I've asked doctors about this before in terms of their own clinical practice. If you have a patient who's in a really distressed state, who's panicked or crying, would you just carry on treating them? And the answer is always, no, of course I wouldn't. Well, what sort of a doctor does that? No, don't hold still, get on with it. You have a duty of care to the patient. You have to try to talk to them, to help them to calm down, find out what the problem is. You certainly don't behave as if they're a bit of meat and just carry on the procedure. It's possible to make a case that the overwhelming majority of abortions are coercive, if one considers how many obstacles there are that prevent a woman from giving full and informed consent in this country. So the question is surely, where do we go from here? There needs to be a concerted campaign, not just to inform the public about the reality of abortion, but to raise awareness about the reality of coercion and therefore the myth of choice. Choice is the consumerist society's false god, and it needs dragging down. After 50 years of argument in this country, it may be time to break it to the public that abortion is not just an attack on life, it's an attack on truth, and therefore ultimately an attack on freedom. Thank you.